Okay, so tonight's presentation is by Jeremy Keith Villaluz, and it takes this topic head on, hosting a conversation with Marcy Kwan, Yinshi Lerman-Tan, and Jessica Battaglio. The four will discuss the intersections of contemporary art, education, mental health, and ethnic studies, and the ability to respond to our contemporary social political climate. It's actually a great pleasure to introduce Jeremy tonight. I first worked with him last year when he was a collaborator on another one of these projects by Jerome Reyes. Part of the Artist Drawing Club, and what makes it a club, is actually asking each of the artists to make recommendations for other artists, their peers, to participate in it. So hopefully there's a bit of a daisy chain that's working its way up over 5 years and will be even stronger over 10 years. So Jeremy recently received his MFA from San Francisco Art Institute and also has begun teaching at Skyline College and San Francisco State University. What I'm really excited about is how Jeremy might approach this kind of uniting both sets of practices. So instead of dividing your art practice and teaching practice, how can the two buttress each other? And it's also exciting to see this kind of take shape, especially having the opportunity to work with an artist so early on in his career. As an artist, he's trained in photography, and his work focuses on notions of landscape, place, and I might say home, through the lens of multiple immigrant subjectivities. The thing I don't think is often said about his work is that it really revolves for me about some of the most human relationships, regardless of the subject of the actual photograph. His current project, Enclave, deals with Daly City, as many of you might know, a suburban town neighboring San Francisco to our south, and is also home to one of the densest populations of Filipinos outside the Philippines. What I find really compelling about this series is the way that Jeremy gives direct voice to some of the most important issues facing the neighborhood, but also combines it with a really strong sense of aesthetics, creating work that is both beautiful and direct at the same moment, which is really kind of a hard thing to do. So at this moment, I'm going to welcome Jeremy to make the rest of the introductions and introduce the program. Thank you.
Cool. Hello. What's up? This is strange. Hi, everybody. So welcome, and thanks to Mark and the Asian Art Museum for having me and these awesome folks up here tonight and doing our thing and hopefully sharing some of our experiences, our knowledge, and all of that good stuff with you all. So I guess what makes sense, I'm going to introduce them in a second, but I think what makes sense is for me to kind of get into my background real quick, because I think a lot of the intersections that come with my background is really what informs like a conversation or a panel like this, right? So as Mark was kind of talking about, real quick, so I'm from Daly City, California, which is this funky triangle thing right here with a hole in the middle. I don't know. So, you know, essentially it's a city that neighbors San Francisco, South San Francisco, Pacifica, and as Mark mentioned, it's a heavy immigrant community, right? So as a person who was born from immigrant parents, immigrant issues in suburbia are kind of on my mind, you know? On a given day, this is kind of what Daly City can look like. It's this really hodgepodge of like, you know, what's that song, Little Boxes, right? And it's what you would imagine suburbia to be. You know, it was this formerly like whites only town built post World War II, you know, and for a multitude of reasons, it eventually became an immigrant community, right? What I particularly find magical about Daly City is that while most of us who grew up in Daly City would say, wow, this place is really dead, we really got to get out of here. You know, like our ideas of success was to leave the town, you know? And it wasn't until I got a lot older, you know, I graduated with a degree in Asian American Studies from the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State, and that was really transformative in terms of like acknowledging the story behind where I come from, where I stand, and the value behind my experience in the suburbs, you know? And really, as a photographer and as an artist, it really taught me, or what it really helped me realize is there's a really deep legacy and a really deep story that needs to be told about Daly City. You know, like say for example, for me personally, going into one of these homes on a typical evening, right? You know, you would want to ask like, what could be going on? And on one hand, you could take a look and say, oh, like a family is gathering, right? And these are some of my dearest friends, right? My partner and my son are in this photograph. And on one hand, there is the magic that comes with familial gatherings, familial bonds. And when we even think deeper into like who these people actually are, this is actually after a meeting, right, of educators in the area who are deeply ingrained in ethnic studies, right? One organization that you're going to hear come up a lot tonight, probably because one of the other panelists, Jessica here, who's a dear friend of mine, we were both a part of, is Pinoy Pinay Educational Partnerships, right? And while they operate predominantly in San Francisco, it's a kindergarten through college teaching pipeline, to which it's really a space for people who want to be educators and are interested in ethnic studies, community advocacy, art, creativity, all of that, have an opportunity to really cut their teeth in classrooms in San Francisco. Now this is a meeting that takes place right after that at one of our directors' home, or two of our directors' homes. And what people don't realize is in a place, you know, that some of the youth in our area still consider to be this dead place known as Daly City, there is this like fantastic thing kind of happening beneath the surface, you know, like many of these people highly instrumental in getting ethnic studies to our youth, getting ethnic studies kind of like put in as a mandate or like as a requirement in the San Francisco Unified School District. And as I was growing up in Daly City, I would never be, you know, privy to the idea that this was even going on, you know. So that's something that's a really big part of my work, is trying to see, you know, to kind of put it in a nutshell, is trying to recognize the cultural wealth that's in my own neighborhood, you know, and trying to see how that cultural wealth really impacts the surrounding neighborhoods and the surrounding cities and the nation at large, you know. A lot of the work that I do is also done in the classroom. You know, I teach at Skyline College, and I also teach at San Francisco State University, and I think that you know, even though a lot of people would say that, oh, he's a photographer and a lot of my work will manifest through photographs, I will always say that like my work as an artist is really trying to play with the intersections of being an educator, a community advocate, and like a creative visual artist. You know, it's the intersections between all of those three things. So that's kind of the intersections of myself that are kind of centered tonight. And that is kind of how I came to like form this panel of speakers who are here today, you know? So real quick, as I get into who our panelists are, I'm just gonna read some bios real quick, if that's cool with you all, and then we'll get into how each of them kind of came to be, right? So first and foremost, we have Marcy Kwan. All the way at the end of the table here. She's assistant professor of art and art history at Stanford University, where she specializes in art and culture of the United States, specifically issues of race and ethnicity and Asian American art. She holds a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, and in 2017, her dissertation, Vernacular Modernism, Joseph Cornell at the Art of Populism, won the University of Pennsylvania's Zuckerman Prize in American Studies. Her book based on this project is under advanced contract with Princeton University Press, and an article on Isamu Noguchi set for Appalachian Spring and Japanese internment is forthcoming from Modernism/Modernity. So welcome, Marcy Kwan. Okay, second is my homie Jess. So Jessica Patalio is a PhD student at the University of Alaska at Anchorage, UAA, a clinical community psychology program emphasizing in indigenous, cultural, and rural psychology. She began her research on microaggressions during her undergraduate at San Francisco State University, and at SFSU, she began her journey as an organizer for SFSU's rich network of Filipina and Filipino-American organizing, and served as an educator for Pinay Pinoy Educational Partnerships. She has continued her journey to Alaska, where she is the co-founder and advisor to Alaskeros Kasamahan, the only Filipino-American student organization at UAA. As a doctoral student, Jessica has expanded her research and currently works with her graduate mentor, Dr. E.J.R. David, to understand the relationship between ethnic identity and mental health. She hopes to use her experience as researcher, educator, activist, and organizer to create clinical and educational interventions that are culturally relevant and responsive for disenfranchised communities. So welcome, Jess. And last but not least, we have Yunshi Lerman-Tan, who is sitting right next to me, who is a PhD candidate at, who's a PhD candidate in art history at Stanford, focusing on American art with interest in archives, language, identity, and time. She's writing her dissertation about John F. Pito, a turn-of-the-century still life painter. Yunshi has served as a teaching assistant at Stanford for courses on American art, including Asian American art, taught by panelists Marcy Kwan and Jeff Chang and Jerome Reyes' course on art and race in post-civil rights America. So welcome, Yunshi. Okay, so that was like a brick of text, paragraphs that, you know, are the highlights of us that I just stumbled upon gloriously. But I think what is probably more important than that, you know, the text-rich paragraphs that we just read out, is really understanding how you all came to getting into the work that we're in, and you know, how that kind of like informs what you do and the purpose that you engage in. So let's get into that, and I guess Jess, you'll start off. I think it's already.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Okay. And so I'm going to introduce a little bit more and explain kind of like how I got to be where I am. So I identify as Filipino American. I'm born and raised in Fairfield, California. For those of you who don't know where that is, it's over there. It's right smack dab in the middle of San Francisco and Sacramento. And so I'll explain a little bit more of the context of how I grew up in Fairfield and how that affected kind of my trajectory. And so I'm getting a PhD in clinical community psychology, emphasizing in all those things. And so I think it's important for me to explain what that is, because there's not a lot of folks doing like clinical community psychology programs. And so if you can think of clinical psychology as creating interventions for one person, so think of like therapy, think of kind of things like that. So the community psychology aspect is creating interventions for the community. So I'm training to try and create interventions, clinical interventions, educational interventions on a community-wide basis, and with focusing in indigenous and rural context and cultural context. I also have the privilege to teach human sexuality at UAA, and I think it's been and I'll talk a little bit more about how post-election, how that has impacted my work in the classroom. And so I grew up in Fairfield, California. At the time when I grew up in Fairfield, California, it was predominantly white neighborhood. Now it has become an immigrant population neighborhood. But so that in many ways affected who I was, my identity. I didn't identify as Filipino American. Like 7-10 years ago, I would not have proudly say that I'm Filipino American. And I was, at that time, I was going through like a lot of mental health issues, going through like things like depression, abusive relationship, things like that. And so it wasn't until I made my way on over into San Francisco State University until I understood that there is a community that's there to love me, that there is a community that I can go to and who I can identify with. And so this background, this picture in the background, it's I'd like to say where I first got politicized in the Filipino, American Collegiate Endeavor and PACE. So there I was taught things about my Filipino identity, about what ethnic studies really was, and more so the fact that I just was not alone in my experiences, and that I'm not alone in not wanting to identify as Filipino for these reasons. And so that's kind of my first foot into community work. So my enter into community work was, I need to give back somehow. This space, this politicization has given me so much. And so that's where I entered into kind of community work. And so that was kind of the folks that I organized with in that organization. So I gave back to the organization that helped me in that way. And then I moved on to PEP, so Pinoy Educational Partnerships, where this is where I met Jeremy, and this is where all of those experiences really came together. And it came together in a way that I was able to kind of organize those experiences into what it's like being an educator in the classroom. And so for me, it was navigating that identity of like, okay, so now I know all this stuff, like now I know all this stuff that I've been politicized about ethnic study, and now is the time for me to see how I can provide that kind of thing we taught high school students. And so this was a space of true healing for me at that time. This was taken in like 2013, 2014. And so through that network of folks, that kind of was what helped me along in my growth. And so I had to move on from that space because I went on to Alaska, so I'm here. I always get like, oh my gosh, you're from Alaska, right? And so yes, I'm from Alaska. So I went there, yeah, right? So I went over to Alaska, and everyone's just like, why are you there? And so like, why Alaska? So Alaska has, one of the only clinical community psychology programs, and it was really to work with this dude. And so this is the person on my right. He's Dr. E.G.R. David. So he was the person to pioneer colonial mentality and kind of quantitate kind of what colonial mentality is and what that looks like. And the person on my left is Ate Allison Tintianca Cubales, who is the founder of Pinoy Educational Partnerships and my mentor currently and during my undergraduate. And so I moved to Alaska, and she's here today. And so I moved to Alaska to further on that education because I felt like there was some way, how do I integrate ethnic studies into psychology? Is there a way to do that? Is there a way to integrate aspects of mental health? And I wanted to know, how do I create those, and how do I help people on an individual basis, but also behaviorally? So I see folks in the community like with anxiety, with depression, with abusive like relationships and things like that. I wanted to know how to help them, not just in an educational space, but also in a space of like clinically. And so I do work, I am being trained as a therapist, and so I do work at a primary care facility in Alaska, and my main population that I work with are immigrants, refugees, and low-income folks. And so I went there to do that and to also kind of further my research. And so that's what my research is currently. It's, if you can understand the stats to it, I just put it there. But really what I found was, so what I wanted to do is, what are some of the protective factors that help us with our mental health when we deal with like racist events, really. And so what I wanted to find out, one of the reasons why I wanted to find that out was because during like all the clinical things that I was doing, I was understanding that there's so many barriers as to why people can't even get to therapy, whether it's financial, whether it's language, things like that. So what can I do? And so I looked into ethnic identity, like how does understanding our ethnic identity help us in the long run? And it actually does. And so I found that, the more microaggressions, so the more kind of little racist events that Filipinos encounter, at the same time, if they felt like they were connected with themselves, their community, and their identity, and they did this through going to things that are in their cultural group, going to like education, like ethnic studies, that it's actually the less report of symptoms of depression that they felt. And this was amazing to me, because I was just like, so what you're saying is that ethnic studies is actually extremely relevant into our mental health. And so that is kind of why I'm there. And so, but yes. And so I took that and I wanted to say, well, it's not just I don't want this to just be pure research. So I went out there and did something with that. So I'm very active in the community over there. I co-founded an organization for Filipino American students, because there was no space for Filipino American students to be Filipinos or people of color in the University of Anchorage. And so I co-founded that with a bunch of other folks, and now we're currently an active student organization, going out there doing work, and we do, and I can talk a little bit later about how the presidency, the election kind of shifted the work that we do in that organization. And so we do things like workshops there on kind of immigration, things like that. And so that's what I do.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, so, you could just push it down.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you. First of all, thank you to Jeremy and Mark for organizing this event and for the opportunity not only to speak, but to speak about building things together, which I really appreciate greatly. I got into art history as an undergraduate, and when I got in, there was no such thing as Asian American art history. I never took a class in it. I don't actually even think that I saw one Asian American artist in any of my survey courses or in any of my subsequent modern art courses. And the same thing in my graduate program. And so I did a dissertation, and when I got here, I promised myself that was something that I would change, because that's something I wanted, and something, moreover, I knew is a part of American art history. So this, of course, is Andrew Russell's East and West Shaking Hands at the Laying of the Last Rail from May 10th, 1863. And it's, the joining of the Transcontinental Railroad. And very famously, this photograph includes none of the Chinese laborers who actually made the railroad, although the last spike, the golden spike engraved with all of the names of the engineers and the so-called important people, which is in Cantor Art Center at Stanford University, was brought to, it was the last spike that was laid. It was brought to the people in this photograph by Chinese laborers. And was in fact who were then shooed away, although perhaps Gordon Chang at Stanford thinks that they're actually laborers visible in this photograph. But even if they were there, or if they're overlooked, the fact is that they've been invisible for so long. We've been invisible for so long, although we have always been here. And that's why I opened my kind of teaching career at Stanford by teaching Asian American art, 1850 to the present, really wanting to start with this history. Yinshi was really instrumental in helping me develop the course, and Jeremy was a guest lecturer and was way more popular than I was. They were like, oh, that guy's really cool. And so, you know, and it's, as when I got here, I also did this survey. I was like, how many times, or where is Asian American art history being taught in this country? And as far as I could tell, the year that I taught this course, it was not being taught in any art history department in the country. Perhaps in Asian American studies, and perhaps going, you know, 1960 to the present, Asian art and culture, but never as an art history course. And I think that's for, you know, many reasons, but, you know, this is an image that I'm sure is familiar to many of you, Jim Dong and Nancy Holmes. Struggle for Low-Income Housing, featuring, of course, Felix Eisen, you know, the great kind of figure at the center of the I Hotel, and here he's in this mural, you know, thrusting a bomb into our view, fighting the forces of the corruption of capitalism and the corrupt government, and, you know, this is an image that is famous to us that I had never seen, but to me, when I saw it, immediately reminded me of all of this, these art historical precedents, you know, from Diego Rivera's Man in the Center of the Rockefeller mural, which was then censored for having an image of Lenin in it, to Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, in which the orb, you know, the glowing orange orb is the sun and the moon, and here that kind of alpha and omega is compressed into a single black void in the center of the canvas, you know, a kind of anus that seems to ready to explode, breaking the borders of this mural, much like Eisen's cane breaches the white border, as if to kind of break the frames around them. So this is something that showed me, you know, that first of all, just the history of activism in the United States and in the Asian American community, and one that's tied not just to identitarian politics, but to a profoundly anti-colonial struggle. But it also showed me, you know, and studying this work also kind of showed me other models for being in the world, and these are works, of course, by Yoko Ono from Grapefruit, works in which she is so generous and generous enough to let the work inhere in the bodies and minds of the readers of these texts. Listen to the sound of the earth turning. That is the work, is what happens in your mind. And that's something to me, you know, that is, again, this model of generosity and of openness, and one tied not to our bodies, but one that is, of course, tied to our bodies and our own experiences and our minds. And Yoko Ono is an absolute hero of mine because of this. She's someone, you know, John's her husband. She's not his wife, to me. But she's also this incredible activist, right? Along with John, creating these posters, War's Over, If You Want It, Love John, Love and Peace, John and Yoko, and which was installed as kind of a public art piece in countries all over the world, using their fame to fight the injustice of the Vietnam War. But more than just what these artists have given me, you know, I also would be remiss to say if I didn't mention that I just feel a calling. I feel really moved by these artists and their works, particularly by this artist, Martin Wong. You know, born in San Francisco, Chinatown, moves to New York. So kind of in the reverse of my own trajectory, I moved here to the Bay Area from New York after spending time, after growing up in Orange County, California. And in this work, Starry Night, you have degrees of language translated into one another, sign language, the constellations, the text of the bricks of the building, which are painted in this incredible thick acrylic, as if our fate is written as much in the fabric of our buildings as they are in the stars, which is something that really reminds me of Jeremy's work. And I actually saw the retrospective, Martin Wong's retrospective, probably 2 days after I found out I got this job, which I was like completely in shock by. And you know, Wong models these gestures, the sign language alphabet, on the cards that if you're in New York City riding a subway, you'll inevitably get one of these cards by someone who's hearing impaired, raising money, asking you to donate money in order to get the sign language alphabet. And in my 13 years in New York City, I had never once been given one of these cards, and in the time, in the train ride from the home to Brooklyn from the Bronx Museum, I received one. And it's there on the screen, it's in my wallet with me always. And so I think that, that was a sign to me, a sign in the stars or in, the fabric of urban life, that this is something that I wanted to do. And it's something that art has given me. And I just want to close by talking about one other thing that art has given me. So this is my grandfather. He arrived in the United States after the Korean War, immediately after, in 1953, and came to Canada, actually, and ended up calling every single university in the American phone book he could get his hands on until one finally gave him a full scholarship to study here. It was a little university in Kentucky. So here you see him in Kentucky. And I always remembered the date of his coming over, not only because of the Korean War, but also because of Robert Frank's 1955, The Americans, his kind of really famous road trip book in which he traced this itinerary across the United States, taking photographs of people in cars, of the people he encountered. And I always had this fantasy that Robert Frank would, I'd flip through that book and I'd come across my grandfather standing next to a Cadillac, as you see him standing next to a car that was definitely not his. I actually, at some point, looked at Frank's itinerary and I was like, oh, he never went to Kentucky. That's impossible. But at the same time, there are stakes to fantasy, just like there are stakes to history. That kind of fantasy and that story reminds me, as I was saying, that we were here, and that my grandfather was here, even if he wasn't captured. And that to me is why, even in this moment of great struggle where it feels like all we should be doing is, fighting the fight. And I agree, and I want to do that. But I also think that this kind of exploration also is rich and important. Thank you.